Case Western Reserve University's Great Thinkers series proudly presents the Origins Science Scholars Program. These lectures are presented by the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, with the generous support of Richard Morrison and the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences, Media Vision, and WVIZ PBS and 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream. Welcome to the Origins Science Scholars Program, a series of talks on current research topics in origin sciences. Hello, my name is Glenn Starkman, Director of the Institute for the Science of Origins, and I am pleased to serve as your host for this series. The talk you're about to watch is entitled The Future of the Planet. In this talk, Chris Cullis, Francis Hobart Herrick Professor and Chair of Biology at Case Western Reserve University and a Fellow of the Institute for the Science of Origins, will tell you about the future of our food supply and how our choices will shape that future. And now, enjoy the talk.
I'm going to try to concentrate on one aspect, which is really the food supply and how that interrelates with population, with water, and with science policy in terms of how research is funded and how we will continue to make the technological gains that have been essential for us to feed ourselves so far. So what I would look at in the first part of the talk, I will look at a historical perspective of what we've managed to do so far in order to keep up with the change in population. Then I'll look at what are the current challenges that we're going to have to try to overcome. And then the last part will be looking at some of the new technologies, including genetically modified crops and some of the political questions and hurdles that need to be crossed in order to be able to continue to apply technological gains to maintain our food supply. So this is just the last 40 or so years, and this is the number of hungry people. It's hovering somewhere between the 800 and 900 million, all right? This is the population change. So over this period of time, the world population has essentially doubled. The number of hungry people has stayed about the same. This spike here was caused by the global recession, the energy, the change in oil prices, and therefore the use of foodstuffs for fuel and the price of food going up dramatically. So there's all of these things are related to one another, and it depends on what's happening in the rest of the world as to what we have to, as to how much food is available, who's going to grow it, how they're going to grow it, and why they're going to grow it. So it's easy enough to feed the about 10 billion that they figure there's going to be people on the earth by 2050. If we just continue to cultivate more larger areas of the land, so we can just decimate the tropical forest and plant more crops. In the long run, that's probably not going to be a great idea. You can continue to use more and more fertilizer, more and more pesticides, and more herbicides, and you can continue to have yield gains. You can also continue to use water at an unsustainable rate, and over the next 30 years or so, we will probably continue to just about manage to feed ourselves. What happens at the end of that, of course, is a very different scenario. And so the challenge really is how do you continue to expand agricultural production while still maintaining some kind of environmental quality as the number of people continue to grow? So here we have the last sort of 60 years, and this line here is dotted because it can be almost anywhere. If we don't get a leveling off of fertility and a reduction in population, this can go up to 25 billion by the year 2100. All right? Or if we really control population, it may stay somewhere between 9 and 10 billion. It's probably not going to get to less than about 10 billion because of the age structure of the world as it is at the moment, the number of people who are going to have children, and importantly, the change in the longevity of the world population. So lifespan has dramatically increased over the last 50 years as well. So it's all of those go together to change your population, and no matter what happens now, that population is going to grow to about 10 billion. Put in a slightly different way, that was just this little piece in here. You can see that we carried along quite happily at a relatively small population, and then 1 billion in 1800, 130 years to double that, another 44 years to double that, and maybe another 40 to 50 years to double that. So this has sort of become linear. The trouble is, your doubling isn't adding another billion people. If you double from 5 to 10, you're adding another 5 billion people. And so this doubling series looks okay in one sense. Oh, we're not growing any faster. But the actual number of people being added is enormous. So we've been sort of feeding ourselves in agriculture for about 10,000 years. The Fertile Crescent, where the first progenitors of wheat still live, and we still mine that basis of diversity. And over these 10,000 years in general, or for most of those, we've improved the yield of our crops by simply growing them, selecting the best, collecting them, planting those out again subsequently, and then picking up the best and so on. Choosing the best land and the best seeds. And we can continue to couple these with fertility management. But when we sort of exhausted the soil, there was enough room for everybody just to move on. So you didn't have to worry about remediating where you were staying, because you would find somewhere else which was equally fertile and you could just move and come back in 100 years' time and that would have regenerated. Those kinds of processes are no longer available to us. We can't just move around and reuse land that isn't being used. And so over this sort of first 9,900 or so years, we simply made these incremental gains, and most of the time, to get more food, we simply planted more land. Modern agriculture started about the middle of the 19th century, and at that point in time, average wheat yield was about 11 bushels per acre. With advent of changing in farming practices, improving the seeds again, that yield doubled in about 91 years. All right? With the advent of the Green Revolution, it doubled again the following 43 years, or thereabouts. And so we're managing to double that. But if you look at that, our population is also doubling at something around about that same rate. So we're not really getting ahead of the game at this point. The best we're doing is staying about where we are. All right? And so we've certainly made huge improvements, and I'd like to show that, you know, some of these have been really good, some of these may not be sustainable. So here's the last 50 years, and in Africa we've made small gains, Europe and America's fairly large gains, and in Asia and Oceania there's been very large gains, these ones being particularly in India and China. So our food has gone up over the world, and it's been going up steadily in most places, but more so in Asia than elsewhere. Looking at the population, you can see that this line is not really trending up very much. Right? So the amount of food per person isn't changing dramatically. Again, we're going to double the yields in the same length of time it takes us to double the population, so we're staying about where we are. Although here this line still looks like it's going up, in general we think that this line is leveling off with the technologies that we currently have. So this is what's happened over the last sort of 150 years. So this line could go almost flat all the way back into history. We didn't make very much gains. We got slightly better crops, but they weren't great. Leaving fields fallow and rotating crops improved yield. The first herbicides, you know, we're now 40 years ago. The first herbicides coming in for weed control dramatically increased the yields. The semi-dwarfs here, which were part of the Green Revolution, made an enormous difference to the yields. And then fungicides for disease resistance also made, but you'll notice each one of these, unless you add something else, plateaus out. So you say, okay, now I can suppress weeds. Once I've made all the gains by not having any competition, then I sit where I am until I come up with some other innovation that allows us to improve what we're doing. Not all crops are equal. All right. So if you hear around there that we're in a corn economy, we kind of are, and the reason is because corn is the poster child for agricultural development. All right. So these are the yields over the last 70 years for corn, gone up about 7-fold. For soybean, has about doubled. All right. And this is one of the sorts of issues that we're having to deal with, that lots of the perception is, well, if we've done this for corn, we can do this for anything else, and so we're not going to run out of food. And I'll just show you why corn is a special case here. So the difference between corn and soybean is that corn has some very specific advantages. Most of the yield has been because we don't grow an inbred crop. That is, we don't keep the seed from the corn that we grow. We plant new seed every year, all right? So the really wealthy seed companies are those that grow the hybrid corn seed, because the farmer has to buy them every single year. So I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. My uncle was a farmer. He grew corn as a commodity, didn't make much money. One of his close neighbors in an isolated region grew corn as the hybrid seed corn. He was the wealthiest farmer around because he was providing the seed corn, which has got the most added value. It's also easy to breed, and there's a large genetic base for the crop, and so you can get gains. Soybean is native to China. In the original domestication, only a very small amount of the genetic diversity was used in developing the soybeans that we use, and therefore we can't make the same kind of gains without going back to the original germplasm, and that takes a very long time to incorporate that. So those gains are steadily reducing. So this is why corn is so good. So, you know, if this happened for us, all of our kids would be basketball players. All right? Here are the two parents. Here's the F1. Right? So if you make a cross between two inbred corn lines, both of which are pretty miserable looking plants, their progeny are fantastic. And the unit of yield for corn is the corn and the seed, two parents, the F1. So that's why corn has managed to dominate the landscape for agriculture, because you can get these enormous improvements. When you look at the other varieties of wheat and rice, so you look what's happened over the last 50 years, in wheat for these new modern varieties from the Green Revolution, they weren't around in '61. They steadily had an increasing share of the market, all right? But notice what we've had to do in order to get them to grow. The amount of irrigation has more than doubled. The amount of fertilizer has gone up 35-fold. And the number of tractors has gone up 23-fold. All right? So in order to take advantage of the new yield potential of these crops, we've had to have a huge amount of input added to it. And so here we are, 1990 for wheat, 1999, what we think the demand's going to be, and so these are the actual average yields. You know, in 10 years, we've put it up by 0.1 of a ton per hectare. In the next 25, we want to put that up by another 0.9. That doesn't scale unless we're going to do something very different. And wheat is one of the really important ones, because wheat and rice are going to provide the staples. Maize or corn is going to be a huge crop, but may be used for other things and processing. These ones are fairly minor and not going to have all of that much increase. So that this is the process that we're going through. We're looking at how do we get this yield to continue to increase, and how do we manage to not have to add enormous amounts of inputs in order to do that, so that we can sustainably improve our agriculture. So the overall issues from this first one is we need to transform agriculture from this very high input. We have to get the most from our fertilizer, water, soils, and seeds. Just as an aside, For corn, if you actually look at the energetics, we're not capturing sunlight. We use more energy to get our bushel of corn than we actually get from the energy that it produces. And there's a very complex interplay between science, technology, economic, political, and psychological issues in order for us to deal with the food supply.
I'm sorry, maybe everyone else knows the answer to this, but what are semi-dwarfs?
So semi-dwarfs are the Green Revolution varieties that were developed by Norman Borlaug in the late 60s and early 70s. So wheat, before that, the amount of seed you got depended on how big the plant was. So you could only get wheat a certain height because then the wind would blow and everything would fall over, get wet, grow fungus, and you get no yield. And they found a way to break that correlation. And so the semi-dwarfs are the very short wheats that yield just as well as the old varieties. The trouble is, in order for them to yield like that, you've got to give them lots and lots of fertilizer and lots of water.
Just this question on corn, and it's with respect to the data behind it. Is all of the yields, is all that data calculated for human consumption, or is animals in there as well? Is that all?
So your question is, we don't eat a huge amount of corn directly. Corn is in the food chain, so an enormous amount of it is used for animal feed, which is a really inefficient way of doing it. If we could change that and directly consume those calories, we would be better off. A lot of it is used obviously in processing. There's corn meal in almost everything. So yes, no, it's part. That's why it's a corn-based economy. You'll find corn everywhere, and obviously over the last decade or so, corn for ethanol has been a major part, and that was one of the reasons why corn prices spiked enormously, because there was this, there was insufficient to go around.
What is the net effect of replacing forests with croplands?
It depends on what question you're trying to answer. So much of the tropical forest, for example, is actually not very good land. So if you cut down the forest and start growing crops, you deplete the soil very, very rapidly. So that's the first one of it. The second one is, in removing the forest, you obviously remove all of that biomass, which then gets degraded and gets turned into carbon dioxide. Perhaps even more importantly is the enormous amount of below ground life, if you like, roots and microorganisms that do sequester huge amounts of carbon. So for most of the time, we don't think about what happens underground. And that's probably one of the more important areas. So to some extent, some of the improvements that you can do is by getting bigger root systems that will grow larger and will sequester more carbon. So it depends on the question you want to ask. So there's a whole range of different answers.
It's interesting you talk about the per capita, and you probably have thought about this, but people are smaller, people are getting larger, so the standard per capita would need to be adjusted, because I would assume that people are, what, 10, 15, 20% bigger? So they're actually, that chart might even be going down on a adjusted per capita basis. Yes or no?
If you mean per human weight, it may well be, yes.
Yeah.
Per unit pound, kilogram, or whatever, it is possible, yes. But I think it's also a false graph in one other way, which I'll also come to, which is that simply says, let's look at all of the food produced. So part of the answer to the last question was, well, we don't directly eat all of that food, and so if we get more corn, our conversion ratio of that food is lower because we feed it to something else before we eat it. All right? If we get more wheat, that's actually much better, because we make that into bread and other things and pasta, and so we directly consume those calories, and so we have a much better efficiency. So there is, and I'll get to that, these changing food preferences, which are also going to drive this whole process.
Is the hybrid corn being used for production of other products, as well as for animal feed, as well as for human consumption?
So it goes, there's lots of corn meal in vast numbers of things, but it's used for animal feed, it's used for human consumption, and obviously at this point in time, it's probably 10 to 15% is used for ethanol production for biofuels. And so that switch, and that was a switch that made a huge difference. I mean, it doubled the price of corn as ethanol subsidies went in. Farmers were then able to grow corn, build an ethanol refinery on their farm, make the ethanol from that and sell it, and they became enormously profitable for a short while.
Thank you for joining us. You have been watching Professor Cullis of Case Western Reserve University discussing the future of the planet, in particular our food supply. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at www.case.edu/origins. In the first part of his talk, Professor Cullis discussed how the growing human population will affect the demand for food. In the second part, Dr. Cullis will discuss what will be needed to meet that increased demand. Now we return to the lecture.
So we've talked about getting the food value, but how do we get that? And so water is probably going to be the most important element around in the future. If wars are going to be fought over everything, it's probably not going to be land, it's going to be water, unless it's land for the water underneath that land. So I'm not sure if anybody knows this, but if you get a kilogram of wheat, you need to use about 350 gallons of water. Right? To get a kilogram of eggs, you need about 875. For rice, you need about 1,000. And for beef, you need about 4,000. So you look at, for beef, you need to say, what does a cow actually use, but what does it eat in terms of corn, grain, and everything else? And if you take all the water that you need for that, that's the equation that you get. All right? So water is a relatively scarce resource. It's getting more scarce as the years go by, and it's something that we need. So when I showed you the slide earlier, the inputs for irrigation to increase those yields were huge. And so all over the world, farmers have been drilling wells, depleting aquifers, all right? So if you take more water out of the ground than you replenish with rain, you eventually deplete the aquifer, all right? It may take you 50 years, but after 50 years, you're in real trouble, all right? The water tables are falling and wells are going dry in countries that contain half the world's population, all right? And so water is going to be a very great determining factor. Irrigation, as we've shown over the last 50 years, has temporarily increased the food supply. But once that water bubble bursts and the aquifer is depleted, you don't just go back to zero. You don't just go back to where you were before, you go back to much lower. Because now you've lost certainly a number of the kinds of varieties that you were growing before that could manage to grow in rain-fed areas. So India, which is obviously will have the largest population in the world, I think, by about 2050. It'll be past China. The Green Revolution was this semi-dwarf rice and wheat that enabled India to go from a net importer of wheat to a net exporter. And over this 30-year period, the grain production more than doubled, all right? But as I said, that was massively aided by genetic gains coupled with changes in the practice of how you grew them. And a lot of that had to do with irrigation. So recently the Indian government has stopped expanding irrigation projects. They've cut back loans, they've reduced budgets for research, and so these thirsty hybrid crops have caused the water table to drop substantially in these areas. And so now farmers are going to have to go back to older varieties which don't yield as well, all right, but maybe yield reasonably in the normal rain-fed situation. So those yield gains are going to drop back down again, all right? So we're not going to be able to grow the really high-producing varieties because we won't have the inputs to sustain that. And so you can't say, oh, I'm going to take a hybrid wheat or a hybrid corn and not give it any inputs, because you won't get anything. You'll get zero. The old varieties will do better under those conditions. So it's one of these cycles that's going round. There's a second issue that's still there, which is that diseases probably cause a loss of about 20 to 30% of the total production every year, right? And there's a lot of work that goes on about those, but there's a disease called wheat rust, And this is now making a reappearance in a different form. So it's rather like so diseases for plants are somewhat similar to those you're used to for humans. It's like the flu. Every year the flu mutates, all right? And so you've got to get a different vaccine in order to be protected. Well, over the years we've been developing disease-resistant plants. But if you have a disease-resistant plant, then you're putting a very high selection pressure on the disease to mutate to overcome that resistance. And so you have this arms wars that you put a resistance gene in a plant and it grows nicely and the disease doesn't attack it. And over a number of years, the disease mutates, now is able to overcome that resistance gene, now attacks it. So you put a new resistance gene in and you go around this cycle, all right? Every time you get a really massive change in the disease, then you have to find some way of counteracting it. And most of the time, we look to the old germplasm. So we go back to the Middle East or go back to somewhere where there's a center of diversity and screen all of the lines, all of the plants growing there to see if there are any that already have a resistance to this particular form of the disease. And if they don't, then we've got to come up with a new strategy to do something with it. And the timeline is quite long. So for the wheat varieties that currently are susceptible to this new strain of wheat rust, you've got to identify a source of resistance. So we'll assume that we can go and look at the world collection of wheats, and we can find one. You've then got to take it, because this is not going to be in a nicely finished variety that you can go and plant out. It's going to be in a weedy little grass that has no yield. So you're going to cross that to your commercial varieties and keep going back crossing it for a number of years to resynthesize your crop variety that just has this gene in it, all right? And then you're going to grow it up to bulk up the seeds, release them to farmers, and it takes about 17 years to go through the cycle once you've found the line that has the resistance. On average, the disease mutates and overcomes the resistance about every 17 years, all right? So you're on a treadmill. You aren't going to get off it. You're just continually going through and looking at emerging threats, trying to find something that's going to do better and continue breeding, all right? So now we come to the current climate for science, which is somewhat different, all right? So since the mid-1800s, and if you can think back to that graph I showed you about the different inputs, fungicides, herbicides, lying fallow, that started in 1860, all right? And that experiment has been going on at Rothamsted Experimental Station just outside London since 1860. They still grow wheat on those fields every year. They have samples that have been kept there. They have frozen samples and dried samples. They can actually go back and look and see what form of what diseases attacked the wheat in 1869. All right? That's been funded through public money, all right? In the US, in the EU, and many parts of the world, public funds for these kinds of projects have pretty well dried up. So if you look at the National Science Foundation, it does have a very small number of long-term ecological research stations, but in general, its grants are given for 2, 3, or 4 years, all right? If you've got 17 years to breed a new wheat variety, nobody's going to get grants to breed wheat, right? And as the USDA has stopped pouring as much money into research in its agricultural stations and more just into extension, all of those programs have disappeared. In the 1970s, Margaret Thatcher sold off the Plant Breeding Institute in Cambridge to Unilever. That was one of the places that had basic scientists who also worked with the industry, and they were building up lots and lots of the wheat collections that would be used to develop new varieties. And so even now, if you look at the total research and development, you know, agriculture is about 5% of the total world R&D. In that, about more than 50% is in the high-income countries, all right? And then in the middle-income and low-income countries, you have obviously a lot in China, some in Latin America, very little in Africa. Since a lot of the research and development is in the high-income countries, those companies who spend more on research than the federal government does, are not going to develop seeds for a resource-poor African farmer, because the resource-poor African farmer is not going to be able to afford to buy the seeds. So you can make it as a philanthropic one, but you can't make money doing that. And so the concentration is how do you make a better corn for the Midwest, not how do you make a better corn for sub-Saharan Africa. Coupled with this is obviously this whole question about what are we doing about biofuels, all right? What I tried to show you was that, food production, which was really agricultural production as a whole, has remained fairly static, and we've been using most of it, right? So if you now want to say, okay, I want to replace 5, 10, 15, 20% of the current oil with biofuels, where do I get that material from, all right? You can't say, well, if I'm going to use soybean oil for that, all right, what am I going to grow to replace the soybean oil that is already being used? It's not as though there's huge stockpiles of oil around the world that you can say, oh, we haven't been using that, we have plenty of surplus. There aren't the surpluses for that. For biofuels, the one that makes the most sense, of course, is palm oil, because it has the very highest yield of oil per unit area, all right? There's a lot of political problems with that as well, because palms grow in tropical regions. And so the oil palm plantations are part of the deforestation. Okay? So if you're going to make biofuels, you've got to just make some decisions as to what you're going to choose. And so I wasn't sure how much time he said put up on there. But just to summarize in this section, the increased gains that we've had so far have been based on increased inputs, that is, more fertilizer, more tractors, and obviously the fertilizer is mostly nitrogen fertilizer, which requires a huge amount of energy to produce, all right? And to start with, a beginning of biotechnology, all right? So that we've now used the technological advances that we've had so far to improve our food production, and we've used all of those up, and the biotechnology is one that I think is one that we're going to have to use a lot more, and that one I will also come back to as causing a political problem, mostly from Europe, but it does go up and down, and it comes up in the US a bit as well, as to how we can use our technology to best effect as we go through this process. And I'm not sure. So the limitations that we have are water. We can't keep expanding the growing area, and people need places to live too, so cities are getting more and more high-rise, but there's still going to need to be more land. Pests and diseases, which are very important and rise cyclically. Global climate change and what's happening with temperatures in particular are important, because as temperatures go up, plants tend to be more stressed, and stressed plants are certainly much more susceptible to pests and diseases. And so you get all of these pieces start to interplay as to whether or not we will be able to improve our yields as the population rises. So we have 7 billion this year, we'll have 10 billion in 2050, and so that's 30% more food at the very best. The other part that's changing as well is this whole need for new crops. So I've talked a little bit about Africa. So Africa previously has consumed large amounts of sorghum and millets, all right? As countries become more wealthy, their food preferences change. So in Africa, if you can afford it, you don't eat sorghum, you eat wheat, all right? So you go take a country that's self-sufficient for its food production if people will eat corn, sorghum, and millet, all right? But the global media, if you like, and everything else says, if you're affluent, you should be eating bread. And so countries now start to import wheat to make bread, all right? And I'll talk a little bit later about the increase in wheat consumption and how many countries in the world simply can't support that. Wheat is a temperate grass, right? It doesn't grow in the tropics. It's not a tropical grass. And so there are real problems in trying to breed wheat that will grow in the tropics. So as you change from a corn economy to a wheat economy, we've seen corn yields have gone up massively, wheat yields have gone up very much less. And so where do you get the seeds of the right varieties? Who's going to produce them? What's it going to cost? And how's that going to work? So overall, in summary, here is the sheep, goats, cattle, pigs and chickens. So we're eating huge amounts more chicken, which are being fed here. Here we have the grains, but potato and cassava, the root crops, and the small grains, millet and sorghum, are staying relatively constant. These are the ones that are going up. And so these are the ones that we probably have the greatest propensity for improving. They're the ones that are going to be least used. All right? Here we're eating much more animal products. This is a very inefficient conversion from here to here and then back to humans.
There's an awful lot of salt water around. If working on crops that might grow in salt water?
Roots really don't like salt. So a lot of the world's land is unusable because it's either saline or has aluminum in it. All right? Those are two of the toxicities that are majorly restrict the use of lands. So there is, people are trying to get plants that will tolerate more salt. But it's not putting salt water in that's a problem. What's the difference between irrigation and rain? All right? Irrigation is groundwater. It contains dissolved salts. Rain is distilled water, it doesn't. And so if you keep irrigating, you raise the salt level of your agricultural lands. You have to stop. You have to stop growing, you have to let it rain and wash all that stuff away, otherwise you start to lose yields. So it's not even just whether we can use salt water, even using normal groundwater, we actually start to salinize the land. So yeah, we'd love it if we could grow them in salt, but there are a small number of things that will, but it's not easy.
What are your thoughts about how well we can keep ahead of Mother Nature, because we've developed antibiotics and Mother Nature has turned us on our heads in many cases with MRSA and VRE, things like that, and then now we see the wheat rust. What are your thoughts about what our real chances are to keep ahead of this?
So I'm not sure I'm really confident we can ever keep ahead. It's actually keeping level is my bigger concern. So every time we try to do this, what happens is we place huge selection pressures on those organisms that we're trying to prevent causing damage. All right? So if you say, I'm going to take an antibiotic, all right, that kills all of the bacteria, all right? Depending on how many you have, and Eric Arts talked a little bit about this, you've only got to have a very small window of multiplication, and then even at a very low mutation rate, you're going to get one that's resistant, right? Because you've killed everything else off, that one resistant one now takes over, all right? And so you've lost that battle. We can show that for many of these instances, the acquisition of resistance is actually deleterious. So if you now take the selection pressure away, the frequency of that resistant one drops way down. It doesn't compete nearly as well with the wild type. All right? So it's trying to maintain this balance so that you don't continuously select for things that are resistant. So for wheat, you try not to have a monoculture so that nothing grows unless it's now a pathogen on that variety. You have a whole lot of different varieties. So essentially what you'd really like is a slow level of infection. So you're not killing everything, so you're not selecting for that one extra virulent one. Because it's always having, even if it arises, it's having to compete with everything else. And so there's lots, and as far as the genetically modified crops situation is concerned, again, as you put in new proteins that will attack those, you will then get more of this selection. So you're trying to make a spectrum. You're not doing one thing and just saying we're only going to use this.
You mentioned global climate change as one of the limitations on food production. Are there places on the planet where climate change could be beneficial to agriculture?
So I think the time would be is if there are places which are currently desert or have very low rainfall that change the rainfall. So that might open up some places that will work. We don't know enough about it and how the patterns are going to change. The current trends, I will get a little bit of that, have nothing to do with that. It just says why I think there's going to be some real problems with that.
Israel, which is basically a desert, has developed a drip irrigation, and it's basically has blossomed, where in this country, I don't know the percentage, but it's very high. The water simply evaporates the way we irrigate. Why can't we go to there? I realize it's expensive, but it's much more productive in the long run.
So again, it depends on how much you want to produce. You know, all of these, lots of these are ones where you can do something on one scale, but if you want to scale it up, it becomes very much more difficult to do. So you can't grow, it's very hard to grow corn on a drip irrigation one. Israel does it really well for things like tomatoes, so horticultural crops do really well. The large commodities tend not to. It's just very difficult to set it up in that kind of area to do that.
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Professor Chris Cullis. Professor Cullis is an expert on how modification of their DNA can improve the plants that we use for food, clothing, and other purposes. In the second part of our talk, we examine the challenges to feeding a growing human population. In our final segment, Dr. Cullis will discuss new technologies that could allow us to overcome those challenges. Now, back to Dr. Cullis.
So now I want to talk about what's happening now and how we can try to deal with some of these issues. And I'm going to basically concentrate on genetically modified plants because this gives us the option of really starting to try to tailor our crops for various uses. So how can they help? What about disease resistance and also things like improved nutrition? So GM crops have been around for about 15 years since the first ones were released. And soybean, maize, cotton, and canola are the four major crops that are currently being used. Rice will join this fairly soon, I think. And the number of acres, the area that has been grown under these has been steadily rising. It's been rising in some parts of the world and not in others. So this is mostly in the Americas, in both North and South, and in China and in India. The currently available crops have two characteristics that have been introduced. One of which is herbicide tolerance, that is the ability to survive a weed killer. And the other one is insect resistance, and it's very more specifically the ability to prevent larvae of Lepidoptera, butterflies, moths, those kinds of insects, from surviving on the plant. All right? And I'll talk about a little bit about both of those in more detail. But China is where a huge amount of this is now going on. So China is looking at both the insect borer, which I'll talk about, and bacterial blight. There's field tests of genetically modified rice. The estimates are that there's about 110 million resource-poor farmers' households that will benefit from this, all right? As the population goes up, they're going to have to produce about 25% more rice to feed their population, and they're now starting to invest centrally a large amount of money in these kinds of regions. But biotechnology at the moment isn't a solution for the yield problem, right? It's a solution for some of the other issues that are going on. So you get a better yield, but it only goes up by one step. What it does do is tend to reduce inputs, and especially things like insecticides and herbicides, by an enormous amount, all right? So in biotech rice, it's going to have a huge impact. Biotech cotton, especially in India, has already had a huge economic impact. I think I'm going to come back to herbicides as well. So stem borers are the poster child for genetically modified crops in one sense. So they are controlled by a gene that's made by a bacterium. So a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, and that's where the initials BT come from, if you ever wondered about that, makes a protein that has very many different forms. And each one of those forms tends to specifically inhibit the gut of a small subset of the Lepidoptera. All right? So you can tailor the kind of protein that you make in your plant to inhibit just those negative pests and not to inhibit those that are considered to be either neutral or advantageous. And so when this first came out, there was a lot of publicity about the swallowtail butterflies that were migrating from Canada to Mexico, and the BT corn was going to kill them. It was only because of the way they did the experiment. There is no evidence, and in fact, there's evidence that they do actually do fairly well on BT corn pollen, and the numbers are increasing. But so this is the insects that we're really looking at, or the pests we're looking at, are those that you can't get at very well. So the stalk borer is the eggs are laid inside the stalk, and then they hatch, and then the larva eats the stalk from the inside. So in corn, it's right at the bottom of the plant. The larva eats it, makes hole, the wind blows, the corn falls over. No yield. All right? It's really hard to get a pesticide down there. All right? I can attest to that because when I was a kid on a farm in Zimbabwe, in the summers when the corn was about this high, you get a can of DDT and a teaspoon, and you go down and you drop a teaspoon of DDT in the top of each one of your corn plants. Stops the corn borer. It's not very environmentally friendly, and it's not very good for one either. But, you know, that's one of the issues that one has to deal with, as to what do you do. If you now get the corn to make this protein, then as soon as that larva starts to eat inside the stem, it gets gut ache, it stops eating, and it dies. All right? It's really, really effective. Now, we come back to one of the questions, which is, won't these become resistant? So the answer is quite possibly. And so there's the strategies are that you put in more than one of these proteins and you change them around so that you don't have too strong a selection pressure to be able to get larvae that are now resistant to these particular sporers. The anti-genetically modified lobby says, these are, all these GM crops are bad for you. As far as I know, nobody has even got sick from a GM crop, but lots of people have died from E. coli, listeria, and all sorts of other things. So from my own point of view, I don't think it's dangerous at all. For corn, it's actually a benefit. So that if you look at corn that's grown even with pesticides, and look at aflatoxin levels in the cornmeal, and aflatoxin is a fairly potent liver carcinogen, it's higher in the non-GM corn than the GM corn. And the reason is because in the non-GM corn, it's impossible to stop some stalk borer activity. So they make holes in the stalk, and the fungi can grow up through these holes and actually grow up into the ear. And so you now get the fungal toxins in the corn, which aren't there if you never get the stalk borer being able to produce. So it's actually a benefit not just for the plant and the environment as far as pesticides are concerned, but it's actually a benefit for the product that comes out. We have the impact, again, is a fairly large impact, which is going up all the time. But if you can stop using herbicides and insecticides, the decrease in fossil fuels from using GM crops now is about 500,000 cars coming off the road. Herbicides, if you use them with a herbicide tolerant, you no longer have to plow your fields because you don't have to get rid of those weeds. All right? You spray the herbicide on the field, and then you directly plant the seeds into that sprayed field. All right? So you lose all of that tilling that you normally do. That breaks up root structures, causes the roots to then decay, releases carbon, and so just the direct drilling is equivalent to removing about 6 million cars off the road. And so these kinds of issues are important for how you decide what is the appropriate equation for growing GM crops versus not. Obviously, we're now going to start to grow energy crops. There's a number of those ones that are being specifically grown. So we've talked about land. There's obviously lots of unproductive marshlands, for example. Are there any of those plants that grow there that we can turn into an energy crop for biofuel? There's a huge amount of matter that's wasted. So the plant I work on is flax, which you get fiber for linen and you get linseed oil from. It's not a huge crop in the US, it's bigger in Canada. But there's 1 million tons of flax straw that's wasted every year in Canada because you can't do anything with it after they've collected the seed for the oil. So can we improve our energy consumption by using a lot? You think of that's how much flax straw there is. Think of how much wheat straw is burnt every year. And you can't, and if you're not going to do no-till agriculture, you can't plow it back in. All right? So those are some of the issues that we're still trying to deal with. As far as health is concerned, golden rice was the first one that was specifically designed to have a therapeutic effect. So vitamin A deficiency is a major problem for those countries where they're very poor and have a rice diet, because rice has almost no vitamin A. All right? In India, there's about 71,000 people die from vitamin A deficiency every year. There's somewhere about they could save with somewhere about 1 million disability years that we could do. It's much cheaper than supplementation, and so if we could have golden rice, which makes provitamin A, it would really make a difference. There's also no problems with distribution. So many therapeutics, you've got to keep cold. Well, if you're in a country where it's really hot and there's no refrigeration, it becomes almost impossible to do that. So this is real rice. This is the first generation. This is the second generation of golden rice. And this one here 72 grams of this a day would provide children with sufficient vitamin A to prevent vitamin A deficiency. Why haven't we got it? It's been available, it's been ready for use since the year 2000. And a major reason has been the EU has decided that genetically modified crops are evil, should not be grown, unsustainable, are going to be bad for the environment, or some other reason, and so they will not accept those. So countries that might want to grow GM rice don't, because they have a European market for their exports. And if there's any contamination of those exports with a genetically modified one, the EU rejects the whole shipment. So Africa doesn't grow GM crops at this stage because their primary market is still Europe. All right? I think this will change. China is busy buying up huge tracts of land in Africa, which will be used for food production. China is certainly accepting of GM technology, and I think as the primary customer of many of these developing countries becomes a country that accepts genetically modified foods, we will see more and more of it used, and I think the EU will become somewhat irrelevant. So genetic manipulation, I think, will be necessary to increase our food supply over the next 50 years. It's essential for improving nutrition in developing countries, but it won't impact changes in food consumption, such as moving away from plants and eating more meat, which is, again, another consequence of development. So the last topic I just want to touch on is climate change, which we've talked a little bit about. The estimates are that most of the effects of climate change are going to be to reduce yields, and some of the largest reductions of yields are probably going to be in wheat. And in India, which is home for 1/7 of mankind and 1/5 of the world's wheat, there are places in there that are predicted to be really bad. Why is that? Well, there are nonlinear effects in climate change, and plants are very susceptible to sudden changes. So here's wheat. Here's the air temperature. It yields very well until you get to this point, and suddenly, over a 3-degree change in the air temperature, you go from a high-yielding wheat to 0. Not a little bit, but 0. It becomes sterile. If you occasionally in the US, you hear about problems when the summer arrives really early and it gets a very hot, dry summer, the corn yields drop. The reason the corn yields drop is because if the temperature goes above a certain level, then the corn pollen becomes sterile. So you just don't get any pollination, you don't get any seeds. Peanuts, the same thing, all right, is a different temperature for peanuts, which is a tropical legume rather than wheat, which is a temperate legume, but the same kind of thing happens. And so climate change is really hard to predict what's going to happen, but what we really do know is that most of our crops are susceptible to this kind of process, all right? Made even worse when you ask, okay, so Africa wants to eat more bread, all right? So you want to grow more wheat, all right? Well, looking at this graph here, it's no good trying to grow wheat in summer in Africa, all right? It's too hot, all right? So you have to grow it in winter. Wait a minute. You get summer rains through most of Africa, so you've got to irrigate it, all right? So as soon as you start saying, are we going to make sub-Saharan Africa based on wheat, there are almost irreconcilable problems, because wheat does not grow there. Now, in 100 years' time, we may have started to breed some tropical wheats. I don't know. But it's certainly going to take a significantly long time, even if we can start putting genes in from elsewhere. So it's things like this that worry a lot of people, not how much warming is there going to be, but if you have if you have 10 hot days when the wheat is flowering, you will get no yield whatsoever. And so it's those kinds of changes in overall patterns that are worrying rather than a net change. So to summarize, what I've tried to show you is that food security on the planet is interrelated and interdependent on technology, and over the last 150 years, technology has driven our yields higher and higher. The gains are steadily reducing, and there's a lot of people who are looking at the present time and saying the genetic gains are less than 1% at this point, and so we've got to do something to change that. Water, which has been a major resource and is being unsustainably used, and therefore we have to try to get drought-tolerant or more water use efficient crop plants in order to get the same yield at the time. Food preferences, which is changing what kinds of crops we're going to grow and how we're going to grow them. And policy effects, that is, how does the policy in the EU affect how other countries will grow things. And with that, I'll stop and say thank you.
This lecture is part of the Origins Science Scholars Program of the Institute for the Science of Origins, a partnership of Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. It has been brought to you with the generous support of Richard Morrison and the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's College of Arts and Sciences, Media Vision, and WVIZ PBS and 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at www.case.edu/origins.